Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. This week, fresh off of her recent reprinting in Double Masters, we are tackling an old classic all the way back from the very first pre-constructed commander decks, Kaalia of the Vast. Kaalia of the Vast is a 4-mana 2/2 flying human cleric, and whenever she attacks, she puts a free angel, demon, or dragon into play attacking with her. Even though she's nearly a decade old, Kaalia has maintained her status, currently sitting as the 36th most popular commander. Her page is so full of hard-hitting demons, dragons, and angels that her high synergy section can't even contain them all. Kaalia is a pretty tricky deck to balance. Most commanders that name specific creature types usually only name one of them, just angels, or just demons, or just dragons. Kaalia names all three, and while we could make a specifically just angel tribal Kaalia deck, that isn't usually what we see going on for Kaalia builds. As a result, we can't actually build in any specific tribal synergies to this deck because any cards that we add that just reference angels, for instance, will only end up synergizing with a third of the deck. So this makes things a little bit tough, but also a little bit exciting. So let's see what we can whip up. Alright, let's get Kaalia's average deck list and load it into the Architect deck building website. Remember, any swaps that we make must be either cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall deck list. Kaalia is a beast. These flying baddies are indeed very bad for our opponents. Lord of the Void, for example, will rip creatures from the top of enemy libraries, and Hellkite Tyrant can steal their mana rocks. Steel Hellkite will destroy any pesky permanents that our opponents are able to assemble, while Master of Cruelties famously sneaks into play with Kaalia's ability, which, when it goes unblocked, will insta-kill that opponent by lowering their life total to 1, whereupon Kaalia can deal lethal damage. All in one attack! Let's not get too distracted by the big creatures though. We're going to make some upgrades in the following 3 categories: budget, tempo, and removal. First up is budget. Kaalia's big baddies can be surprisingly expensive, but here's the thing. They don't need to be. When you're attacking me with Kaalia and you're dropping free creatures into play with her ability, it doesn't matter if I'm being hit with a creature that costs $30 or $1.25. I'm still getting hurt either way. In fact, I would honestly argue that the specific angels and demons and dragons that you want to use should probably actually be the lowest on the priority list when it comes to investing in this deck, because splashy as those may be, Kaalia needs to make sure that the rest of the deck actually supports her strategy of cheating them into play in the first place. If you're throwing this deck together for the first time, try to focus your investment on the more important flying creatures first. Aurelia, for example, doubles our damage output and triggers Kaalia twice, and Gisela is just one of the best Boros cards in the format, full stop. There are 6 flying creatures that I'll be swapping out in this section though, because they're just a lot of money to fork over if you're beginning this build. Razaketh the Foul-Blooded is a huge tutoring demon. He hits hard, but more importantly, in response to removal, he can sacrifice our creatures before they would die to refill our hand with more gas and keep us chugging along. He's one of the more expensive cards in the deck though, so let's swap him for another fun demon, Doom Whisperer. This thing also lets us pay life, but to help sort out our draws. It's kind of fun to use it to fill the graveyard too, in case we happen upon a reanimation effect. Balefire Dragon is next. This is one of the spiciest dragons out there, and the price certainly proves it. I'll swap it for the inexpensive Dracoseth. Importantly, Dracoseth won't trigger when put onto the battlefield with Kaalia's ability, but it will keep the board clear of any annoying blockers and utility creatures every turn afterwards. Archfiend of Despair is a pretty phenomenal demon, but it also has a pretty phenomenal price tag too. Let's swap it for its junior, Sower of Discord. This demon links 2 enemy life totals together, so any damage we deal to opponent number 1 will also be felt by opponent number 2. This demon never really gained much traction in other decks because it often disincentivizes the linked players from attacking one another, but in a deck like Kaalia, who wants each opponent to get KO'd right quick, this is a happy budget replacement. My next 2 cuts are both angels, Lyra Dawnbringer and Gisela the Broken Blade. Lyra's not the most expensive card in the deck, anywhere from $8 to $12 depending on where you buy from, but if you were to replace this with the recently reprinted Baneslayer Angel from M21, you'd do well there. That's not quite the swap I'm gonna do, but it's a fine one to make. Meanwhile, Gisela pairs happily with the Bruna in the list, flipping over into Brizella if you manage to get both in play. This is a hilarious thing if you can pull it off, but it's rare, and that rarity is not quite worth Gisela's price tag. Plus, I'm less interested in lifelink for this deck. We want to lower enemy life totals rather than increasing our own. To that end, let's swap these angels for some dragons. Terror of Mount Valus was pricey at first launch, but it's very budget-friendly nowadays. If this thing swings in with Kaalia and even one other attacking creature, we'll be doing probably at least 20 damage in one attack. I'm also adding in a peculiar one here, Yosei. As a simple 5/5 flyer, Yosei doesn't seem very exciting, especially compared to other pricey Kamigawa dragons like Kokosho. However, I like Yosei as a really excellent deterrent. If an opponent finds a board wipe to scour our progress, Yosei will tap down their permanents and basically make them skip their next turn, punishing them for setting us back and helping us catch back up. Finally, Terror of the Peaks. I really like this dragon, but its damage output isn't quite worth the price tag for this particular list. I'm instead going to recommend Utvara Hellkite. This doesn't make a dragon on the first swing when Kaalia puts it into play, but it does make a dragon on the swing after that, and then more on the swing after that, and then more on the swings after that. I've seen Utvara take over a game all on its own, so watch out for this one. So folks may have noticed that I haven't removed the most expensive angel in the list, Avacyn Angel of Hope. This is partly because of her reprint in Double Masters, which may not topple her price too drastically, but still does lower it. And if you upgrade your deck with some pricier cards, I do think Avacyn is a much more important investment than the angels we discussed earlier like Gisela and Lyra, because Avacyn's protection is just primo to help cover this deck's biggest weakness, Wraths. Demonic Tutor, on the other hand, this is also a very pricey card, so I'm going to stop and ask what the most important card is for this deck that the Tutor will be used to fetch. In my eyes, it's Greaves. We want Kaalia to come out swinging right away, or we want our big angels, like Avacyn, to be safe from removal. So if you don't have a Demonic Tutor, I recommend using Open the Armory as a budget replacement instead to go and find those shoes. I've made a habit of cutting tutors in other Upping the Average videos, including clunkers like Diabolic Tutor, but I'm not actually going to be cutting that one here. I actually find tutors to be more useful for Kaalia than a lot of other commanders out there. It feels pretty good to go find the specific angel or demon that you want before you move into combat and cheat it into play for free. Not to get too ahead of myself, but Kaalia is a bit of a glass cannon, so a tutor can help her find the removal that she needs to potentially claw back into a game, or the dragon that she needs to burn an opponent down. So the Diabolic is safe here, but, don't feel like you need to spend $35 on the other one. Oh, and there are 3 fetch lands in this list, which I'm going to swap out for more budget-friendly lands. On this note, fetches are really great and all, but I'd actually recommend prioritizing these lands instead if you begin to upgrade your Kaalia deck. The Modern Horizons lands deal inconsequential damage and can cash in to dig for more flyers later, and Hall of the Bandit Lord gets any one of our awesome creatures, especially Kaalia, slamming into the red zone right away. Kaalia plays huge creatures for completely free, so we don't need a hyper-expensive mana base to play the cards that we want to play. But if you are going to upgrade the mana base, I recommend those lands over the fetches first. Try to focus on the untapped lands too, as much as possible. We want to make sure that we can play Kaalia on curve. Speaking of which, let's move now to our second category, Tempo. I'm usually a Necromancy player, so this is a little bit awkward to admit, but honestly, Kaalia is one of my favorite commander designs of all time, because she just beautifully encapsulates something wonderful about the color red. With that said, she also occasionally has the habit of creating a dynamic that not every commander table is necessarily used to. Put simply, she often goes either 0 miles per hour or 100 miles per hour, and there's not a lot of gray area in between. This is a really common cadence for aggro decks, especially in one-on-one formats. One deck will come blazing out the gates really quickly, trying to take the other one out before they manage to stabilize and take back control of the game. Kaalia is the same way. She burns bright, but briefly, and if we don't take our opponents out quick enough, one of them's most likely going to find removal that sets us all the way back to square one, at which point we'll be stuck probably top decking and optimistically playing one big flying creature per turn. That's not going to work out for us. Our opponents will easily overtake us if that ends up being the case. This means Kaalia has to be really fast, but also, frankly, really cutthroat, taking out specific players to try and mitigate any possible removal from multiple opponents. But we also have to really acknowledge that, an opponent is almost guaranteed to find some form of removal before we're able to take the entire table out. So we're stuck trying to find a balance between cards that help us end the game quickly, but also cards that help us recover when things go wrong. This is tough because too many super fast cards means that one Wrath is all it takes to completely knock us out of the game, whereas too many recovery cards means that we won't have enough damage output to actually take an opponent down, so they'll definitely knock us out of the game. So let's talk about some stankers in the creature category. I've got 3 more creatures I don't like very much, and they all happen to be angels. Rhea Dawnbringer is nigh uncastable at 9 mana, which means she basically always needs to be put into play with Kaalia's ability. But she specifically works only really after we've already lost some creatures. Not really my kind of tempo. Teriel, I'm sad to say, is very similar. Given the speed we want this deck to go, Teriel is planning for a much longer journey than our GPS indicates we should travel. And finally, Red Achroma. This is a pretty inoffensive inclusion, all things considered, but I've just always felt so underwhelmed by her toolkit. So let's swap some of these out. I have 2 more angels I think will help out Kaalia, and they're pretty budget friendly. More than that, I think they cover for the role that Rhea and Teriel were attempting to fulfill, because these help shield us from removal and prevent us from losing too much to board wipes. The first is one Kaalia players are probably already familiar with and seem to have moved away from, but I still think it warrants consideration. Twilight Shepherd does basically nothing when it first drops into play, but she shields us from a wrath by coming back with Persist and returning our dead creatures to our hand to help us get started again. I can totally see this one getting squeezed out as players upgrade into the powerful Archfiends and such, but if you want to build Kaalia without breaking the bank, this can be helpful to make sure that she doesn't fall out of the game completely after a single board wipe and then get stuck top decking. The other ad here is Demon Lord Belzenlock. It's a demon who draws cards. He's not even that expensive to hardcast either. This can refill an empty hand and get us right back into the game, and the life loss is absolutely worth it to keep the tank full. He's even good when we're ahead to find more creatures to cheat into play. It sounds really scary at first, because what if we lose like 9 or 12 or 15 life to this creature's uncontrollable ability? But honestly, that's really good. We're more afraid of only drawing 1 card with this creature's ability. Belzenlock never ceases to impress me when I see it in Kaalia decks. So tempo's a really big thing for Kaalia, especially when it comes to ramp. Ramp at 3 mana is not ideal at all for Kaalia. We want ramp on turn 2 because Kaalia wants to come down quickly. If she's attacking on turn 6 to play a free 6-drop, that's really underwhelming, and actually might even cost us the game if we're that far behind. I'll make an exception for the Lantern because it fixes color so well, but honestly, you should really focus on the 2 mana even more than expensive 3 mana cards like this. The one I'm particularly going to focus on is Darksteel Ingot. Let's swap this out for a Wait, this talisman is $5? Okay, well then how about a Felwar Stone? Felwar Stone is also $5? Geez, even Wayfarer's Bauble is climbing up. Okay, I'll go with Bauble for this one, but man, the price on these cards should indicate their importance. Cheap mana ramp will get Kaalia out a full turn faster, and that extra swing can be the difference between our victory and our defeat. It's not just about mana, though. If Kaalia can come down swinging the very first turn she's in play, that closes the window of opportunities our opponents have to stop her. We have a Dragon Tempest in the list already, but I'll throw in a Fervor too. I'm going to cut some cards to make room for these, though. Sarah the Benevolent does not belong in this average deck. She makes a tiny angel, which is not great, and she can give +1/+1 to our flying creatures, which won't even apply to the creature that Kaalia cheats into play, and her emblem won't even really matter to a fast strategy like this, so yeah, get out of here. I'm not a big fan of Phyrexian Reclamation either. The synergy here is kinda strange. I think I understand what the thought process is supposed to be, returning dead flyers to our hand for Kaalia to then cheat them back into play, but in that case, why not just reanimate them instead? In any case, I'm cutting this one, and I'm replacing it with something that this deck really needs, some card advantage. Night's Whisper and Painful Truths are 2 of my favorite black draw spells, and they're good no matter when we cast them, whether we're ahead and we need to find a couple of more creatures to cheat into play, or if we're behind and are trying to catch back up. There's also a piece of equipment here that I just don't like at all. Whisper Silk Cloak. It's often a really cool card in a lot of decks, but in this one, it's a Whisper Silk Clunk. This card is protective, sure, but it's a tempo loss that will get in our way. The time and mana this card takes to suit up Kaalia or any other creature is just not worth the investment, especially not compared to the card that I'm going to swap it for. Giver of Runes. Mother of Runes is already in the main deck, so why not have both? These come down early and save our valuable flyers from removal right away, covering up that awkward timing where we attempt to equip our creature with protective gear and an opponent swipes them away in response. Speaking of which, let's move to Section 3, Removal. This is a gripe I've made before, but I'm going to reiterate it here anyway. A deck like this should weight its removal more towards the mass removal side rather than the single target removal side, because the most important timing for removal is after we ourselves have already been wrathed and we're trying to get back into the game. When that's the case, single target removal is not going to cut it. We need mass removal to wipe the slate clean so we can claw back in. Plus, I just don't like some of these removal spells. Sorry, I don't know how else to say it. Vindicate is sorcery speed, and that's really only okay. I'm going to swap it for Generous Gift, which can also hit any permanent and gives our opponent back a ground elephant that we'll have no problem soaring right over. Utter End and Return to Dust, I think I just have some type of vendetta against, but I really just don't like spending 4 mana to off 1 permanent or sometimes 2. 4 mana is Wrath territory. Chaos Warp is only 1 mana cheaper, but it gets the job done better. Mortify, meanwhile, I feel has outlived its usefulness. Good for budget, but when I play Mardu, I tell you what, I just stinking love the card Crackling Doom. The 2 damage is not really important, but this tags the biggest creature from each opponent, which often means their commander. This card is hilarious, and I just love the way that it scales to multiplayer. Alright, before we move on, I have to address the elephant in the room. Armageddon. So it's obvious why this shows up in Kaalia's deck. She plays creatures for free, so if she can stick and play, destroying all lands is a way to basically make sure that no one else can cast spells or get in the way of her pummeling the table with free flying baddies. This kind of plays into one of the weirder things about Kaalia and Commander. She's in no way a competitive commander, but she's maybe a bit more cutthroat than the typical EDH table tends to be. For example, she can blaze down one opponent really efficiently, only for a second opponent to wrath the board, which then might produce a longer game of EDH, which then leaves the first opponent maybe stuck sitting there for a while. So in defense of Armageddon here, I would kind of argue that if you are going to play Mass Land Destruction in Commander, this is kind of the ideal way to do it, because casting this spell means that you guarantee swift victory over all of your opponents more or less at the same time. In fact, I probably shouldn't even be mentioning this in the removal section, but actually in the tempo section from earlier, because this isn't a removal spell. It's a spell that you cast when you're ahead, because when you do, you win. But I am still going to be cutting this one. It's just not personally how I find fun in Commander. But what I find to be fun is not necessarily the same thing that you find to be fun, so that's what matters more. If this is something you're interested in, make sure that you check with the folks that you regularly play against to see if this will be a mutually enjoyable experience. But also, when it comes to Mass Land Destruction, I really think there's only 2 options here. You either don't do it at all, or you commit and go big with it. And that's the disconnect for me. That's what I can't do. I'm only afraid of 2 things in this world: exiling my graveyard and commitment. Alright, now the rats. We've actually got 3 in the average list already, including the hilarious Ruinous Ultimatum, so I'll add in just 2 more here. Blasphemous Act was reprinted in Double Masters, finally, so it's getting right into this deck. There are tons of other great wrath effects out there in these colors too, and if we weren't on a budget, I'd say Toxic Deluge is a total cert. But you know what's really fun? Wraths that have the potential to leave some of our creatures untouched. So I'm throwing in Crux of Fate. This card can destroy all non-dragon creatures, potentially leaving us with 1 or 2 that can continue to pummel down our opponents. Or, if we're playing against a dragon tribal deck, such as the really popular Dragon, well, we can choose to destroy all dragons instead and make that player have a really bad day. Told you Kaalia was cutthroat. This is a budget-friendly wrath that offers our commander some awesome hidden flexibility. Perfect. And here's our final list. A link to it can be found in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I also kind of hope that maybe Kaalia has earned a bit of a new lease on life, so to say. Like I mentioned before, she really is one of my favorite Commander card designs, and she kind of earned a reputation back in 2011 based on the way that she played then. So it'll be interesting to see if a new influx of Kaalia players find that she has that same reputation, or possibly if there's something new that she can adjust to now that the meta is almost a decade older. If you have recommendations for other cards that you really think Kaalia players ought to be using in their decks, make sure you leave those in the comments below, as well as any suggestions that you have for other commanders that you'd like to see in future Upping the Average videos. Thanks so much for watching.